So I'm gonna talk a little bit about stuff that's already been discussed, but I'll try and tackle it from a slightly different angle. I want to begin with the sort of motivation. What is the reason why something like a universal basic income or a contributory income is increasingly necessary, and why it's become so popular in the media again? The primary reason, of course, is the changing technologies that we're seeing. The rapid transformation of what's possible in terms of technology. I'm sure most people have probably heard the stat that says 47% of all American jobs could be automated within the next 2 decades. You may not have heard that actually that's one of the countries that's least affected by automation. A similar study was done in Europe. It suggested that about 54% of European jobs could be automated. Studies that looked at Nigeria suggested 65%. Ethiopia is about 85% of jobs could be automated there. So we have a massive amount of jobs that could be possibly taken by robots and algorithms and all these new fancy technologies that we have. Now, when you talk to economists, the first thing that they always say is when you look at history, capitalism has constantly been introducing new technologies. It hasn't meant that we get mass unemployment. Capitalism produces new jobs even as it's taking old jobs. And so economists will often say, well, actually, it's not really a problem. All this automation that we have is not really going to cause mass unemployment. Now, I think this is wrong. I think this is wrong because economists, as usual, miss the social context. So if we look at earlier periods of automation, we're missing some key aspects today. So we look at from, say, the 1900s to the 1930s. What do we have then? We have a labor movement which is pushing for a shorter and shorter working week. So we have a 60-hour working week at the turn of the century. By the 1930s, we've got a 40-hour working week, almost down to a 30-hour working week. If we look at the post-war era, what do we see there? We see rapid economic growth after the devastation of World War II. We see governments which are committed to full employment, and we have half the population which is forced to stay at home and take care of children. None of that exists today. We don't have a labor movement which is pushing for a shorter working week. We don't have rapid economic growth, which would mean rapid job growth. We don't have governments committed to full employment. Instead, they're committed to austerity. And we have a much higher proportion of women in the workplace than ever before. So all of this means that, effectively, technology today is going to take many more jobs than it has in the past. And I don't think we can be sort of cavalier about what's going to happen to the labor market. Now, I think our response has to be to reduce work. And ultimately, as a Marxist, my interest here is in actually eliminating the coercion of wage labor. I take the sort of Robert Brenner approach, which says that capitalism is generalized market dependency. It's the fact that we are all reliant upon markets. And I think if we can actually get rid of the coercion of the labor market, the fact that in order to survive, we have to go out and find a job and get an income that way, if we can undermine that aspect of capitalism, it gives us a lot of power, and we can start thinking about what post-capitalism might actually look like. So this is my interest. I think we should be trying to reduce work today in whatever way possible. But this means building up a social system which can enable it. It means building up a social system which doesn't just leave people in poverty and unemployment. Now, the old welfare system that we had was premised on employment. It was premised upon, ideally, the factory job. It was reliant upon full employment policies, which meant that most people were in work, and very few people had to be paid for unemployment. It was based upon contributions through work, so you would pay some money whenever you get a paycheck, and eventually when you're unemployed, you'd get some of that money back. It was also premised upon a strong divide between work and non-work, something which is breaking down today. People today, you're much more used to working on, say, a 6-month contract, working on part-time work or 0-hours contracts. The sort of divide that was at the heart of the post-war system between work and non-work no longer exists. So I think we need a new system. And this is where UBI comes in, the universal basic income, and it's also where the contributory income comes in as well. Now, I think contributory income, as I understand it, is very much at this point a research project designed to pose questions and try and find out answers to them. So I don't think it's a problem that a contributory income can't at this point answer every single question that's put to it. But I do want to put some challenges forward for both the UBI and for a contributory income. Things that I think are crucially important to give consideration to. The first one simply is how to fund it. Now we've heard some suggestions beforehand, carbon tax, inheritance taxes, land taxes, something like a Tobin tax as well. Now I think these are all useful ideas for how to get money to pay for a basic income, but the question is, how do you get the politics of it? We've been trying to get a Tobin tax for 20, 30 years now. We've had very little success at doing that. What has changed now that means we can actually get that sort of money? So the first challenge, how do we fund a basic income? The second challenge is, how do we make it universal? How do we make it so that it applies not just to a citizen of a country, but also to new immigrants? How do we make it that it isn't just going to heighten the borders around Europe that are already killing thousands of people every year? So how do we enable it in a way, a universal basic income, in a way that doesn't exclude a particular group of people? The third question is, how do we avoid recuperation? So the contributory income, the basis of it is that people are being paid for production of social value that isn't necessarily waged work. Now this is great and all, fully support it, but of course capitalism is great at recuperating this sort of stuff. Open source is the best example of this. Open source is at the basis of Google's project, of Facebook's project, of Microsoft's project. It's at the basis of these massive platform monopolies. So how are we going to make it so contributory income doesn't just feed into these massive systems of recuperation? So that's the third question. The fourth question is, how do we ensure that a contributory income or a basic income doesn't enable the demolition of the welfare state? How do we make sure that it doesn't mean that we cut out minimum wage, that we cut out any sort of funding for people with disabilities, elderly people, people with children, all the sort of extra areas of the welfare state that apply to a smaller group of people, and they aren't universal. I think this is the logic of the neoliberal approach to the basic income, is to replace all of this. Public health care, public housing, public education, replace it with just giving people money. And how do we prevent that? I think ultimately the answer to all four of these questions relies on the biggest question, which is the question of power. And this is something that hasn't really been discussed yet. We can imagine these ideas of a basic income that solves all these problems, is properly leftist, and we can agree, undermines wage labor, it's fantastic, but how do we actually get it? This is the big, big question. I don't think there's any easy answer, unfortunately. The left is on its back heels across the world. We've just seen the rise of Trump and a sort of reactionary white nationalism within America. We've got a sort of confused and muddled left across Europe. The left is not really in power or in a position to actually get a good universal basic income or get a good contributory income at this moment. So we have to answer the question of how do we build up power. I think this is necessarily long-term. And it involves all the traditional things of organizing, getting people together. But I think one crucial thing is also undermining the sense of work that we have in society. I think no matter who you talk to today, the average person on the street or most academics, they value work. And work is seen as something which is good, it's seen as something as necessary to contribute to society in order to get anything back from it. So the value of work is still widely accepted. And I think we need to question this. We need to demolish it eventually. And this is again, a sort of long-term project. It's not going to happen overnight. But this is, I think, core to any sort of project which wants to get a basic income off the ground or a contributory income off the ground, is to transform what people think about work. So I guess this is my basic point, is that we are facing massive challenges within capitalism today. We have some really great answers. We don't have the mechanisms to achieve them at the moment. And this is, I think, the crucial question going forward. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Donc il a dit qu'il allait s'intéresser à la fois au revenu de base et au revenu contributif, et pas pour les comparer, mais plutôt pour dire quels sont les grands challenges qui concernent les grandes questions qu'il faut se poser pour penser ces revenus. La première question, c'est comment le financer. La deuxième, c'est comment on fait pour que les politiques veuillent bien financer ça. Ensuite, comment on le rend universel, on peut faire en sorte que, je ne sais pas, les personnes handicapées, les migrants, etc. en bénéficient. Comment éviter la récupération par le capitalisme, donc, parce que le capitalisme récupère toujours très bien ce genre de choses, comme les logiciels open source qui sont à la base des grandes plateformes.
Excusez-moi, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Est-ce que vous pouvez écarter le microphone de la bouche? Je n'entends rien.
Il faut me le dire. Comment on fait en sorte qu'il ne soit pas... comment on fait en sorte que le welfare state ne soit pas détruit, parce que du coup, c'était là en fait les personnes handicapées, etc. ont besoin notamment, on a besoin d'avoir un système social, et que l'approche néolibérale a tendance à vouloir utiliser le revenu de base pour remplacer tout le welfare state. Et donc, en définitive, la grande question qu'il pense qu'on n'a pas posée, c'est la question du pouvoir. Comment on construit un pouvoir? Et c'est forcément une question de long terme. Ça signifie des choses classiques comme comment on fait pour que les gens travaillent ensemble et se réunissent. En particulier, donc, enfin, là, on parle de la gauche, en disant, et il disait aussi que la gauche était sur les genoux et qu'il fallait... que c'était forcément à long terme, qu'il fallait qu'on construise ce pouvoir, et notamment faire en sorte que les gens transforment leur rapport au travail, parce que la plupart des gens trouvent qu'il y a une valeur dans le travail, et donc ça peut être un projet à long terme de détruire cette vision du travail.
Merci beaucoup, Raphaël.
I'm going to pick up on just a few quick things. I think on the issue of calculation, I mean, my sort of concern about calculation is less about trying to preserve some space of non-calculable qualitative area. I think actually calculation, much like technology, is something which is both useful and possibly dominating and domineering. I'm more interested in the question of how can we actually use calculation to further ourselves. Everything that I'm using here, all this technology is premised upon calculation. I don't think the regime of calculation is necessarily nihilistic or anything like that. I do want to make a point, though, about the sort of distinction between labor and work, because I think it's useful to make a philosophical distinction, but at the same time, there's a sort of lived experience of work and a lived sense of work. And I think work today effectively breaks down to suffering. I think if when you talk to people about what work means for them, it is suffering. It is sort of explains a lot of people's actions around work. So as an academic, for instance, my work is supposed to be pleasurable and quite enjoyable, and as a result, I should get paid less because my work isn't about suffering. And I think you see that in a number of different places. If work is enjoyable, it's a license to actually cut the wages of those workers. It's the same thing with people who are seen to be doing nothing. The sort of hatred and vitriol that gets spewed at homeless people on the street who are begging for money, I think it can only really be explained by the fact that people don't see them as suffering. And they're getting money for nothing, and that this is the reason why there's so much hate spewed at them. So I think work is all tied up with suffering, and what we get remunerated for is suffering. Our sort of participation in suffering. And of course this has a theological basis as well that we need to question and critique. But I think if we want to actually overcome the regime of work that we have today, we have to be moving away from this sort of idea of work. And then one quick point on nature of power. So I raised the issue of, how do we gain power? And I think fundamentally, regardless of what we want to do on the left, we need to question how do we gain power. And I think one of the key things right now is the fact that we don't have a class identity. We don't have solidarity amongst people. And in part this is because manufacturing is broken down, the sort of traditional physical spaces in which people would come to see themselves as sharing a common interest, those spaces are gone, or they're in China, or they're elsewhere. Services are not, service economy is not a good area for solidarity. People are split up and distributed and dispersed everywhere. So I don't think class identity functions anymore, and this is partly why, particularly in the UK, and I think less so here, but in the UK, if one group goes on strike, everybody else hates them. And this is like the worst case of non-class solidarity whatsoever. It's just objective hate for any other group that seem to be getting ahead. This is why I think populism is quite an interesting response, and I think populism understood not in the sort of mainstream media sense of like just breaking things down to the basic level, but populism understood in the Claudian sense as sort of stitching together different interest groups into a common counter-hegemonic project. I think populism in that sense has quite a lot to offer. I think you look at Occupy, I think that's a populist movement. I think even actually, I don't know if people know the term for people who supported Trump, but deplorables. So Hillary Clinton casually called them a bunch of deplorable idiots or something like that. And they took this up as a brand name. They decided, yes, we are the deplorables. This wasn't a pre-constituted group. It wasn't a pre-constituted identity. It was something that was named and came into existence as a result of it. And maybe this is where I think I sort of push back on some of Bernard's stuff on social medias. I do think social media has an important role to play in this. The Deplorables is a social media constructed group. It's a social media constructed mode of solidarity. Same thing with Occupy, same thing with Black Lives Matter. And in fact, every significant populist movement of recent years has been social media driven. So I think there's a lot of value in actually pushing for politics through that as well. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nick. Vous voulez traduire, Raphaël? On va vous passer un micro. Thank you.
Alors il a repris une série de points donc, par rapport à la calculabilité. Pour lui, l'idée n'est pas forcément de préserver une part de non calculable ou qui serait plus qualitative. C'est pas vraiment la question qui se pose, mais plutôt comment on peut utiliser la calculabilité pour aller plus loin. J'avoue que j'ai pas saisi autre chose. Oui, si. Alors après, sur la distinction entre travail et emploi, lui pense que en fait, l'expérience générale du travail pour les gens, c'est la souffrance. Et ça explique beaucoup d'actions dans la société. Par exemple, quand quelqu'un fait un travail qu'on juge plus agréable, on considère qu'il devrait être payé moins, comme un universitaire par exemple. Et puis, par exemple, des gens qu'on voit comme ne faisant apparemment rien, ou des gens qui mendient par exemple et qui touchent de l'argent pour rien, on considère qu'ils ne souffrent pas. Donc globalement, on est rémunéré pour notre souffrance, et bien sûr ça a des bases aussi religieuses et qu'il faudrait aussi questionner. Donc pour lui, la question c'est comment on gagne du pouvoir, donc on a besoin de se demander comment regagner du pouvoir, parce qu'en fait on n'a pas d'identité de classe, donc cette gauche n'a pas d'identité de classe. Il n'y a plus les usines qui étaient des lieux où les gens partageaient une expérience et un lieu qui permettait de créer une conscience de classe. Et aujourd'hui, dans l'économie des services, les gens sont dispersés, sont atomisés, donc c'est plus difficile. L'identité de classe ne fonctionne plus, et par exemple, quand un groupe fait la grève, quand un groupe social fait une grève, les autres groupes sociaux le détestent automatiquement. Donc il pense qu'il faudrait peut-être recréer une forme de populisme, mais entendu au sens de révolter tous ensemble en tant que groupe pour créer un projet de contre-hégémonie, enfin une nouvelle...
Désolé, ça nous arrive de temps en temps, on a un problème avec la sono, on ne sait pas pourquoi.
C'est le mot populisme.
On a fait venir les ingénieurs de l'IRCAM, ils n'ont pas trouvé.
Est-ce que le micro fonctionne encore?
Alors, il y a un truc à
Tiens, tu fais
c'est la
passer.
batterie qui est morte, tout simplement.
Non, non, c'est pas la batterie qui est morte.
Ah, alors,
Malheureusement,
ça ressort.
ça fait ça régulièrement. Il faut que j'aille pisser absolument, donc je vous laisse présider le truc.
Alors, de toute façon, j'ai presque fini. Donc, l'idée serait plutôt de produire une contre-hégémonie culturelle, donc de former cette classe de groupes qui se révoltent, comme on a pu voir aussi dans les mouvements des places. Par rapport aux gens qui soutenaient Trump, ils ont été surnommés aux États-Unis les deplorables, les déplorables. Et ils n'avaient pas d'identité préconstituée, ces gens-là, mais quand on a commencé à les surnommer les déplorables, ils se sont mis à manifester en utilisant le terme « nous sommes les déplorables ». Donc c'est de ce genre de groupe dont parle Nick. Et par rapport aux réseaux sociaux, c'est là où il a une opposition assez grande avec Brnard Stiegler, puisqu'en fait, il pense qu'ils ont une grande importance, ces réseaux sociaux, justement pour faire se regrouper ces gens atomisés. Et c'est ce qu'on a vu. On a vu que ces réseaux sociaux étaient à la base des mouvements comme Occupy et comme tous les grands mouvements populistes des dernières années.